Okay, our third speaker is Janice Liedl, a professor and chair of history at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. Her current research focuses on families, religious culture, and the experience of crime in early modern Britain. Her most recent articles were published in Early Modern Women and Rethinking History. She has also co-edited or contributed to several books exploring historical perspectives on popular culture, including Star Wars and History, The Hobbit and History, and Game of Thrones versus History. So Janice, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'd like to begin by acknowledging today the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and to also recognize that Laurentian University, from where I teach, is located on the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe First Nations, as well as the greater city of Sudbury, including the traditional lands of the Wahnapitae First Nations. So today I'm talking to you about untrue relations, godly family discipline, and domestic crime in Stuart Britain. We all know tales of murder, assault, and betrayal are popular productions in societies, and these were just the case in 17th century Britain. A key part of the appeal of such stories was when they involved family situations, they reinforced the values of godly family discipline. These accounts did more than detail criminal misdeeds. They framed them within a model of proper patriarchal Protestant good order. Households that tolerated sinfulness and disorder threatened the well-being not just of their inhabitants, but of all the community. We see some sense of this with the sermons of nonconformist Edward Lawrence. In 1681, his collection, Parents Groan Over Their Wicked Children, warned that children might easily escalate from, say, the sin of theft, next to thrust a dagger into your father's heart. While Lawrence's problem with his own 9 children never reached that level of horror, he complained bitterly that 2 of them had made him, quote, the father of fools, but he attested to the possibility of worse hurt. And many could sympathize with this kind of fatherly frustration. But for our pamphlet literature of the time, it's that more literal threat to families that strikes the deepest chord. In sermons, ballads, in trials and executions, as we've learned, reading about such news gripped the nation, and murder grabbed attention, particularly murders within the family. Ungodly individuals who could wreak havoc within your own family, within your own household, through murderous acts, that's surely the most terrifying manifestation of possible disorder. So print reports of these domestic upsets, they're shaped by genre conventions, both long-standing in English literature and relatively novel. News reporting, in particular, evolves enormously over the 17th century, both as censorship controls wane and are eventually pushed aside, also as the public interest in true crime literature is being demonstrated. We see this with publications such as Old Bailey's very famous Session Papers, which began publication in 1674. In the first decades of its existence, the Old Bailey reports were usually quite brief for each trial, comprehensive only in covering all of the trials, or most of them, that had occurred in each session. Such brevity in each case contrasts markedly with the form of pamphlet coverage of individual criminal events, something that goes on well before the 1670s. And still, even amongst these pamphlets, we see considerable variation in how the tales are presented. So my paper today closely examines 2 cases of domestic murder from the late Stuart era, both of which are reported in near simultaneous but distinct versions. These accounts showcase how the range of reporting that the authors and publishers could follow at the time, from very close productions of what occurred at the trial to much more lurid presentations subordinating court evidence to narratives of godly intervention and family disorder. So the first set of pamphlets that I'm going to look at were occasioned by a murder that happened in early 1674. In March of that year, the assizes at Chelmsford saw a sensational trial for charges of treason and murder. It resulted in the execution of two men, James Alsop Sr. and one of his sons, William. Two contemporary pamphlets recording the trial survive. The first, Treason and Murder Discovered, authored by an unnamed individual identifying himself as a trial goer, balances both those charges of treason and murder in its fairly measured treatment. The second account, Treason and Murder, or The Bloody Father-in-Law, proclaimed itself a full survey of the murders and how the murderers were taken. The treasonous offenses here, offenses of coin clipping, are mentioned only insofar as they serve as impetus for the murder of a nameless daughter-in-law of that James Alsop Sr. So in some ways, superficially, the two pamphlets are quite comparable. They're similar length, 7 and 8 pages. They agree on most of the matters of fact, that the elder Alsop and his wife claimed a robber had murdered their daughter-in-law during the night. The first pamphlet, Treason and Murder Discovered, highlights the offense of coin clipping, the treasonous offense, because to deface, to trim the edges of the coins was an offense against the crown. It had specific reference to the specific coins and statutes, how they were defaced. The author also credits in this account the usual form of indictments for all of this information. In fact, this whole pamphlet appears to closely follow trial events and trial materials. We have a great deal of information that probably originated in the examinations used to support the indictment of James Alsop Sr., also his wife Dorothy, and their two sons, William and James Jr., who was husband of the murdered woman. A first constable's report also appears in great detail in this initial pamphlet. The second constable's account, however, is described only as having much the same effect with his partners and agreed in the same circumstances, one step towards brevity. Evidence of a servant and a goldsmith also appears in moderate detail to further incriminate Alsop Sr. and William's work as coin clippers. I speculate that all the material was drawn here from JP's examination ahead of the trial. Customarily, either the JP himself or the recording clerk would bring to the assizes. Immediately following this prefatory material in the pamphlet comes a discussion of the trial events unfolding. We start to get a sense of the actual words of people at the court. The father is described, for example, as having, quote, made a long, tedious, and impertinent discourse in his defense. Treason and Murder Discovered further then shares the account of 4 individuals described as being witnesses, sharing their testimony in various ways at the assize. The coroner who found window glass unbroken, the murder victim's young daughter who was brought to speak of her experiences that night, a surgeon who decided to make a claim against the older James Alsop, and finally, an unnamed person of quality who discovered a bloody thumbprint and other evidence on the elder Alsop's clothing and presented that as suspicious evidence. Even the wife, Dorothy Alsop, is drawn in by his discoveries. We're told that on Mrs. Alsop's neckerchief, there was a spot of blood, which she said was iron mold. A basin of water was brought to try it. However, the blood washed clear out where no iron mold would. In the final paragraphs of this trial-centric account, readers learned that the jury's deliberation resulted in the following verdict. Jury went out, returned that old Alsop was guilty of clipping and the murder, his wife and James Alsop Jr. not guilty, William Alsop also guilty by his own confession. Now, in contrast to this rather chronological, formal account of what happens at the trial, the second version, the bloody father-in-law, is clearly more sensational and less trial-focused. The anonymous author assures the reader that any detailed preamble to draw the reader in would be pure impiety. Instead, the nameless victim, her children, and her Alsop relations are briefly sketched out, and an experience of domestic harmony under a shared roof sadly fails because of the failure of godly discipline. In this case, the devil, always busy to foment mischief, being naturally an enemy to love and peace, is ready to blow those sparks of dissension into a flame of malice, not to be quenched, but with blood. This dissension appears to be centered around that treasonous element of the trial, Alsop the elder's practice of coin clipping. We are told the victim discovered and condemned this, details not mentioned in the other pamphlet. And in The Bloody Father-in-Law, we are told this doubtless caused Satan to intervene, suggesting 1,000 ways to dispatch her. And it also describes 2 such attempts that seem to have preceded the actual murder, where hitherto Providence had overruled the black designs of attempts to off the daughter-in-law. Details as well about how the murder was timed to coincide with her planned trip to faraway Yorkshire, how the daughter had fearfully viewed a masked and black-gowned assailant slitting her mother's throat from ear to ear, and that the family was planning to bury the victim in an orchard, all paint a very different picture from the first account, one that is entirely focused on murder, and a murder that involves supernatural assistance from the devil, but also that involves supernatural providential discovery to not go unpunished. There are elements which appear parallel in the two, but have a simply different spin in the second. For example, just as mentioned in the trial account, not only was an intact pane of glass removed from the window of the victim's bedchamber. That was discovered to implicate the Alsops rather than any outsider who might have broken the glass. So too, we are told of a complete spider's web that was there across the window, supposedly that was used to enter. However, again, in The Bloody Father-in-Law, that cobweb is not simply evidence. It is described as providential. God puts it there to discover the true murderer. The devil is not only in James Alsop Sr.'s head, though it's in the details that deviate between the two versions. Whereas the first pamphlet claimed the young daughter witnessed someone her grandmother's height leaving her mother's bedroom after the slaying, the bloody father-in-law tells readers that she witnessed somebody much about the tallness of her grandfather. When son William's alias is mentioned in the trial-based account, the second elaborates further that possessions were found under this alias linked to the murder, including a bloody shirt, a strange mask, clippings and filings of silver, all to helpfully implicate William in both treason and murder. As a final note, the bloody father-in-law also explained that William alleged he pled guilty only to take the crime off from his father, elements we do not see in the first. I highlight the difference, not to cast doubt on either account, but to emphasize how much a genre of trial reporting is already clear by the 1670s and how that's different from the more morally satisfying true crime family stories. Details drawn from the examination, a chronology of events in the trial conduct, the specific contributions of witnesses, all are evident in both works, but they inform the pamphlets differently. And I would argue that Treason and Murder Discovered, the first trial-based account, probably was used to help inform the other, rather than bogging down the murderous story of patriarchal transgressions with specifics of treasonous coin clippings. Those elements are almost entirely absent from the second version, instead adding many details tied into providential protectiveness and satanic suggestion to give readers a sense both what went wrong in the Alsop household and how God made that right through the justice. Another pair of pamphlets involve the case of Philip Stansfield, son to Sir James Stansfield, that was produced in 1688. A pair of pamphlets, one produced by clerk of the Edinburgh Court, where the trial was held early in 1688, and the other produced by a London publisher, showcase very different takes on how we could look at godly discipline in the cases of domestic murder. So the first one, the trial of Sir Philip Stansfield, was published in 1688. It is very much a work of official court record and documentation. The royal license of the printer is highlighted. The trial is introduced with the Latinized names and authorities of the 4 presiding justices. Indictment details are interwoven with references to Scots parliamentary acts, recognizing treason and parricide. It also shows how Sir James planned to bypass the normal lines of succession that would have given his son Philip recognition of his inheritance, and instead to give his properties to Philip's younger brother, all supported a motive to murder. The general introduction to this long pamphlet, some 50 pages, lays out all that is claimed from an increasingly strained family relationship preceding the murder through Philip's weeping confession, before the pamphlet then proceeds to lay out the arguments made by prosecutors, pursuers in the Scots legal term, and procurators in defense counsel. So the shape of the trial, again, is very evident, from pre-trial investigations and examinations through to appearances before the justices of Edinburgh. Every individual is identified fully and legally. We also have a great insight into the procurators in defense's arguments, dismissing allegations, say, of treasonous words that Philip was supposed to have levied against King James, all as unbelievable. The pursuers, the prosecutors, though, consistently link all of this as an attack on the pater patriae, and of course, Philip's own father himself, the pater familias. Overall, as I would say, the presentation of testimony and arguments seems especially robust. For example, when the pamphlet reports how one of Philip Stansfield's cousins, James Mitchell, established premeditation, offers detail that shows how closely this comes from the trial materials. We have details of how Mitchell was purged and sworn. We have the evidence introduced point by point with its legal framework. And finally, the testimony is confirmed, and that this is the truth as he shall answer to God, sic subscribitur. The final attestation that this was the work of the clerk of the court cements that this is an authentic, deeply detailed trial account, along with the verdict of Philip guilty of treason, of cursing his father, of accession to the murder, the sentence of death, dismemberment, and erasure from memory, as well as the attestation that all of this was achieved. Compare this detailed, exhaustive legal record with a true relation of a barbarous, bloody murder committed by Philip Stansfield upon the person of his father, a 5-page pamphlet produced by J. Conyers in Holborn in 1688. Now, Conyers is a prolific publisher of ballads, plays, and popular histories. I would count them of varying degrees of truthfulness. The title page of this work advertises that a true relation of a barbarous, bloody murder is an account of inhumane practices and unnatural contrivances, all used to bring about Philip's wicked purpose. And it is written as a caution to all graceless persons. This version, I would argue, appears to borrow from Gordon's very detailed account. It informs readers of a trial with proceedings and evidence, but only in the most sketchy of detail. Less than a page is needed to cover what 20 pages do in Gordon's account to bring readers far as the February trial. A few excerpts from the trial appear as quotations used to liven what is here a family drama. And so the anonymous author of the second pamphlet draws from earlier testimonies as well as trial commentaries. The two accounts differ dramatically in length, tone, legal framing, but they do both spend a great deal of time on the most notorious, shocking element of the case, the allegation that Sir James's corpse helped to discover his murderer. James's corpse, we are told, bled fresh, anew, when touched by his son and murderer as the body was exhumed from the grave for a posthumous examination. While one of Philip's procurators dismissed this as, quote, but a superstitious observation without any ground either in law or reason, others at the trial asserted, and in the second pamphlet emphasized, belief that this event revealed Philip Stansfield's guilt. It lay in line with Scots folklore. A corpse would freshly bleed in the presence of its murderer. And damningly enough for Philip, even the defendant himself appeared to support this interpretation. We are told, with blood afresh upon him, dissoiled all his hands, it struck him with a terror that he immediately let his father's head and body fall with violence and fled from the body. In consternation and confusion, cried, Lord, have mercy on me, and bowed himself down over a seat in the church where the corpse was inspected, wiping his father's innocent blood off his own murdering hands upon his clothes. As you could surmise from the level of detail in that account, or emphatic detail, I would comment that this is the second trial or the second account, not the first. Other evidence besides words remembered by his acquaintance helped to convict Philip of his father's murder. Medical examinations showed no water in the stomach or lungs that would support a verdict of accidental drowning or suicide, which had been Philip's claim. Instead, marks consistent with strangulation were observed, but it was the circumstance of the bleeding corpse that drew the greatest level of scrutiny, according to both accounts. Even Gordon, the clerk of the court, his account explains that there are clearly supernatural elements, as there can be no natural reason be given, but ordinary and wonderful providence of God in this kind of discovery of murder. More prosaically, though, some of the surgeons involved suggested the bleeding might have been evidence of strangulation just freshly brought forth by moving the corpse. Philip, in the full trial account, the first of these pamphlets, averred that his reaction was purely shock and horror at the condition of his dead father's body. But both explanations, the scientific words of the surgeon and Philip's reaction, seemed to act against any claims of innocence. Conyers' short, sensational pamphlet briefly recounts the most notable particulars of the testimony with great emphasis on the disconcerting bleeding Philip's fearful reaction. And finally, Philip's finish appearing obstinate to the end, denying the godly truth that he has witnessed and brought forth. The final paragraph of Conyers' work appends a strong moral to the story. Philip is told to be one of a type, bold and daring sinners, whose impiety leads them only to satanic slavery. Readers are advised again that had he kept to his duty and filial obedience, he could have escaped this doom. The affection and tenderness of an indulgent father like Sir James might have properly been rewarded. Instead, young Stansfield has been executed, erased from history. Of course, he was not. Both publications ensured his memory survived, as well as the odd particularities of his father's death, discovery, and the trial of his father's murder that they all preserved. I would argue all of these works focus on the essential failure of godly discipline within families that troubled both the law courts and society. Whether in Alsop's story, where the treasonous pursuit of coining profits or satanic inspiration could lead to a daughter-in-law's death, or Stansfield's account, where a greedy son's determination to enjoy an inheritance, even if he had to kill to obtain it, family function or dysfunction stands at the heart of the matter. Trials provided clear documentation of this, but it's particularly in the more creative retellings, the bloody father-in-law, a true relation of a barbarous bloody murder, where we see, despite constraints of length, clear lessons of godliness and family order relying on trial events. True crime could quickly be conveyed to readers, along with a satisfying sense that divine justice was served by our worldly justice system, at least in the case of these horrific murderers. Thank you.